Hi, everybody. I hope everybody's having a great FairCon 2020. Certainly has been a memorable year in a lot of ways, and hopefully you guys had a great couple of days of the conference as well. So excited to be here with Sarina Hothi from Doordash. She's going to be sharing her experiences learning and implementing a FAIR program there. And no matter how many times I implement programs at different companies and things like that, I feel like there's so much we can learn from our peers, and I'm so excited that she's going to be sharing some tips and lessons learned for all of us to learn from. Please use the chat feature during the session to ask questions, and we can interact with each other, would be great. And with that, I will turn over to Sarina, and I will come back at the end to do a little bit of Q&A.
Hi, thank you, Evan. Thank you for having me here. I'm excited to go over my journey, my experience here. I'm Sarina, and I'm currently a security project manager at Doordash. For those of you who have never heard of Doordash, Doordash is a on-demand app that uses logistics services to connect our consumers to their favorite local and national merchants. We currently do over 800,000 deliveries a day with the help of our Dashers. We operate in over 3,000 cities. We're currently based in the US, Canada, and Australia. And we work with over 200,000 merchants. So needless to say, we deal with a lot of data. I've been at Doordash for a little less than a year now, but I've been in engineering security for about 3 years. I want to first start out by telling you how I first learned about FAIR. I first learned about the FAIR model last year during my interview at Doordash. During my interview, my now manager, Rusty, had whiteboarded out the FAIR risk taxonomy, and I was immediately amazed at how intuitive it was, and the fact that I was able to quickly grasp it. Especially since, interviews can be a little nerve-wracking, but seeing the model mapped out and seeing how you would not only look at the dollar amount of a risk event occurring, but then multiplying it by the frequency of that event happening just felt like common sense. And yet at the same time, this ability to quantify risk has been such a challenge for most tech companies. I can tell you firsthand, it was definitely a topic that came up during every interview I had at other tech companies. And I was just amazed that during this particular interview, instead of them asking me, how would I define risk or measure risk, they had already found something that would work. So needless to say, after the interview, I immediately went out and purchased the book. I wasn't certain that I would get the job, but I was just fascinated in learning more. And I felt like this is something that could help me throughout my career, or at least get me through other interviews. And fortunately, I did get the job. And naturally, one of the first things I was tasked with was implementing FAIR throughout Doordash. And I can now say that luckily the book purchase did come in use. And like I said, I've been at Doordash for less than a year, and with any program, we still have a lot of opportunity for improvement of FAIR. But I can say that even the most basic FAIR concepts have helped me out tremendously. Today I'm here to talk about how even in the early stages of implementation has helped us communicate and determine what's actually, oops, went to the wrong slide. There we go. Helped us communicate and determine what's actually at risk, and how understanding FAIR has not only benefited Doordash, but my own professional growth. First and foremost, using the FAIR terminology and the ontology has really helped us decompose complex problems and communicate the risk within others in the organization. So when I joined, we would have regular consultants that would come in to help us assess our security programs. And these types of consulting engagements often produce an exhaustive list of broad recommendations. And because, as cybersecurity professionals, the security world, there's always a million things you can and should do. The work is just never ending. And I have to admit, it was a bit overwhelming to try and prioritize and roadmap the list of recommendations while trying to stand up a FAIR program. But fortunately, we partnered with Risklands and Protiviti to help kind of guide us through our FAIR journey. I don't know where I would be without them. Our teams at Doordash was able to kind of break that down, that exhaustive list of recommendations, by simply using the FAIR risk terminology to help drive the conversations internally. You know, we hadn't yet completed the analysis of all of our assets and risk plans, but we kind of knew what our top risk scenarios were based off of our initial comprehensive triage analysis. But by taking some of those scenarios and looking at how scenarios were set up in triage in Risklands, we were able to really decompose the problem and narrow down the scope of recommendations given to us, which led to much easier conversation with our stakeholders, especially since as a security team, we were the ones going to our asset owners with the problem, and having that conversation framed around the asset and threat types would then naturally lead our asset owners to drive the conversation towards focusing on what controls we would need, such as like resistance controls, detection, prevention, etc. And from there, we were able to turn this broad list of recommendations into like narrowly scoped projects with clear direction and path. For example, let's say one of the recommendations that we were given was to expand our data protection program. When we took that recommendation, we broke it down into sizable chunks by determining which particular assets we wanted to focus on and what types of threats were we really trying to solve for, and then which control types would help us reduce the impact of that threat. The framework, the FAIR framework, and this terminology made it easier for us to paint that picture of what exactly we're trying to accomplish to our eng teams who are outside of security, like for example, saying malicious outsider, this database in this scenario. Once we had scoped all the recommendations and had narrowed down that list into actionable projects, the second thing the FAIR model helped us with was demonstrating the impact that an initiative can have. I know, so far it sounds like we went a little out of order and we're a bit scattered. But Doordash is very much your typical Silicon Valley startup. We're always going 1,000 miles a minute, and often we have multiple things moving in parallel that we're also trying to intersect at once. So by the time Protiviti and I had completed the current state assessments of our assets, the eng teams had already begun working on the projects that we had scoped. And as they're going in and implementing the controls, we were able to go back and do a comparative analysis. So for example, like basically, look at what our risk was pre-controls and versus post-controls. This really helped us tell the story as to the impact these projects were having from a dollars perspective. Especially like as a project manager, oftentimes these projects can go for several quarters worth of work. And it could really be almost a little, if you're constantly hitting roadblocks and one thing after another, it can almost be easy for teams to quickly be like, hey, let's, we don't have the bandwidth, or let's wait a few more quarters out for this. We've tried it, we spent an entire quarter on this, X, Y, and Z. But being able to clearly demonstrate, like, we will be reducing our risk by X amount of dollars, really help the story as why we need to keep going in this direction that we're heading in, and really help keep your stakeholders engaged. And it was able to arm these teams, these outside teams with justification as to why we're implementing these security initiatives, and why this would be worth their time and money, because they were able to financially show their leaders that and demonstrate the overall impact that their teams were going to be having. And especially since, there are often so many competing priorities that our teams are having to face. Lastly, I would say one of the key takeaways at FAIR for me personally was being able to know how to direct a conversation. More often than not, I'll have people that'll come to me with some edge cases, even people on my own security team that will say, ignore that project or ignore those long list of recommendations. XYZ is now a huge problem, and now the end of the world is coming. And by simply verbally going through the FAIR risk taxonomy and asking questions such as, how often does the end of the world truly happen? How much resources were spent on trying to remediate the problem in the past or currently? What's the threat that would cause the world to end? And without even having to do a full-blown analysis, more often than not, we would collectively come to the conclusion that and determine quickly that in the grand scheme of things, that the world is not actually ending, and that the issue at hand is not really a priority. And that 5 minutes spent verbally going through the taxonomy has probably saved me hundreds of hours of wheel spinning. And being able to ensure that my projects stay on track and we're able to kind of check things off that long, exhaustive list of recommendations. It's so easy for our security teams to get bombarded with random edge cases and be forced to continually switch gears. It often leaves some cybersecurity teams feeling like they never are able to impactfully accomplish anything. Like I said, I realized it's a lot easier said than done to implement a FAIR program. The work at Doordash that we've done to date has required the time and effort of our security, legal, compliance, platform, finance teams. I mean, the list goes on. And we still have a long way to go before we're making progress, but I'm more than confident that we won't make any decisions. We'll start all of our decision making with FAIR first. Make sure to go to the next slide. And so the most important advice that I could give is that you don't have to have every element of your FAIR program organized in order to start applying it. No matter where you're at in your FAIR journey, the 3 benefits that will immediately be realized is that you'll be able to break down and focus the scope of your projects into specific scenarios, and then demonstrate the business value of security to non-security stakeholders. And just knowing the taxonomy will really help keep your teams on track and allow everyone to collectively understand what's really at risk and prevent scope creep. And like I said, we have a lot of opportunity for growth, but I'm more than confident that we'll get to a point that all of our security additions will not be considered. We'll start without considering FAIR first. And it's exciting to hear that risk quantification model that I first heard about during an interview a year ago is now being implemented or considered by all of the impressive organizations that are represented here today. Thanks for letting me be here to tell my story.
Thanks so much, Sarina. I'm sure that resonated with everybody who's listening today, who's probably had similar experiences. One of the things I found really interesting about your story is you've only been doing this for about a year now, which is pretty quick. How long did it take you to really start to feel comfortable enough with FAIR and some of the concepts that you could start explaining it to other people and walking them through it?
Well, so I took my FAIR certification test about 5 months into the FAIR program. I would say the real test was probably 3 weeks ago. Another team came to me and said, we want to learn more about FAIR. Your manager said that there was this great program. And I basically held a meeting, went over the taxonomy and showed them how we were doing current assessments and ran through an ad hoc assessment with them. So that was a true test, I would say about 3 weeks ago. So I'm about 10, 11 months in. But yeah, I managed to pass the test in April, but I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, 5 months ago I was at a 5 and 10 being like, knowing the most. I'm probably at a 9 right now.
Yeah. When you're asking them some of those questions when they come to you with the sky is falling type scenario and you're trying to dig in, how explicit are you with them that you're using FAIR to guide your questions, or is that just kind of in the background?
I try to keep it in a background because I want to lead them to the answer first. So I don't say, let's start with a FAIR analysis, because then they may try, if they're not familiar with FAIR, they don't know FAIR, they may try to discredit it versus looking at the facts. So I just try to just have that conversation and then maybe later go over with them. I'm like, by the way we broke this down is how, yeah.
So when you are introducing people, like you mentioned you did recently, do you have some kind of pitch deck or elevator speech or something like that about how you start off that conversation and get them interested in it?
I don't have anything formal written. I do have pieces of presentations and decks that I pieced together. As I was going through this and teaching this other team 3 or 4 weeks ago, I had used a previous deck that was given to me, I believe by Creativity. And I was always going through it. I was like, oh, I should have made it this slide this way or that way, because I didn't have time to prepare beforehand. I just kind of went winged it, and like I said, I walked away thinking I knowing I was going to make my own deck, but I don't have one set up yet.
Yeah. Anything that surprised you, really resonated with people, or kind of fell flat in terms of what you tried to walk them through?
I surprisingly seemed to really grasp to it, and they were more than willing. They want to know more, so we have another session set up with them in a week to really set up scenarios and walk them through risk lens and how the tool goes and creating their assets and all of that. So yeah, I don't think it fell flat. I'll know more in a week though.
That's great, yeah. You mentioned the exhaustive list of findings or potential issues that you guys started with and used FAIR to prioritize. Anything there that maybe started out as a high priority and through the FAIR analysis dropped down, or vice versa?
Not necessarily. I mean, the recommendations were pretty broad. So we were able to use FAIR to figure out what specific assets that we wanted to focus on first. So yes, in some ways we were able to say, okay, this asset we can push off to another quarter, or and et cetera. But I would say, being at a startup too, there's always so much that to focus on and so much that can be done and would be done. But nothing that was too surprising. It really just helped us prioritize.
How do you tackle the scope? I know people can often get intimidated by the breadth of all the different cybersecurity scenarios and IT risk scenarios and such you could possibly look at. How did you tackle keeping that to a manageable number?
I think when people come up to you like this has a large attack vector, and it's like, what does that mean? What's the attack vector? Like who's the threat? Where is the asset? And guiding that conversation from there to even help that person realize like what they're trying to prevent is kind of where FAIR has helped us, at least at the beginning stages, And that's what helped us narrow the scope of each of these projects and really to help us define this, the controls we wanted in place. And the controls that we implemented were the projects themselves.
Gotcha. I'm curious if you guys considered doing more of a DIY rather than going with a commercial tool to roll this out. Is that something that you considered, and what was the tipping point for having a tool to manage this on?
I think because the decision to go with the tool was made before I joined. And then I think because we were all a little new with FAIR, we just wanted something to kind of help guide us and hold our hands through it. And maybe someday in the future, we might consider a DIY. But for now, we're loving the tools itself. Just be able to just input your information and the data helpers and just update the information as you go along has been very helpful.
Sounds like that also helped you with the scoping and focusing on the priority items, yeah.
Yes, definitely.
You mentioned some partners along the way internally that you've worked with. What's been the reaction of your peers and other risk or compliance groups or audit groups as you've started to socialize this?
It's been extremely positive, and so I think because of it, our legal team breathes a little bit easier, and they always come to us with more and more people wanting to gain interest and like learn more about it and try to figure out the impact. But so far, it's been really positive. And like I said, right now it's really in scope for the security team, and I do see it in the future being used by everyone.
Are they starting to talk the fair terminology and fair speak at all?
I think they have, and I think it's just because of pure like just interaction with us and the security team, because we use the words and so like certain terms and terminology, so they're starting to, and it just kind of becomes this natural progression where everyone starts to talk the same way.
That's great. Well, I think the thing I'm really interested in is if you had to do this over again, looking back on the last year, is there anything you would do differently or approach differently in terms of the rollout?
I think I would just tell myself to breathe a little. It is a bit overwhelming when you're looking at it and you're figuring out, okay, well, what does this question necessarily mean about like, you know, some of the questions you go through when you're implementing going through the risk lens profile or doing an analysis, and making those definitions or figuring out the data helpers for like employee hourly wage and meeting with legal and payroll and yeah, all of those things. It can be a bit overwhelming. And as a startup, we don't always necessarily had, you know, documentation for everything. So I would just say, yeah, just taking a break and then utilizing that opportunity to build out from there. And like, I think me also being a new employee at the time, I was still getting used to the company, getting to know who the teams are, the players are, but then this helped me and forced me to get to know them, and figure out what it is that they're doing and go from there. But I think I probably would have utilized Sphere more to just dive in deeper into some of the technical assets that we have, like, you know, a data warehouse versus just understanding who has access, what types of, you know, data is in there, and vice versa, but actually how everything operates.
Well, it sounds like your project management background certainly came in handy of running an initiative this long and complicated.
Yes, definitely did.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your story. And thank you everybody for the great conversation on the chat.
Thank you.
Thanks.